Hello and welcome back to IB Bio Made Simple. Today we're going to talk about part 2 of your 5.1 notes for evidence for evolution. So last time we talked about the first two statements up here. We talked about understanding 1 and understanding 2. Today we are going to talk about all the rest of these. So it's really clear there that the fossil record is the really important point in this section. So if you need to, go back and watch the part 1 video to make sure you really have a good hold on that. So to start today, we're going to talk about selective breeding. So understanding 3, selective breeding of domesticated animals shows that artificial selection can cause evolution. So we need to start as always with defining our problem. So selective breeding, what is it? Well, selective breeding is the process by which humans breed animals and plants for particular traits. So you can see, obviously from the picture, one of the examples of this would be dogs. All domesticated dogs are the same species, but we have different breeds that we have bred to have specific traits, whether they be size or whether they be things like herding, like sheepdogs, or racing, like greyhounds. Cows are another example of selective breeding. Cows have been bred for increased milk yield or for increased meat yield. They're two different kinds of cows, but they've both been bred for those traits. And we also have crops that have been bred for increased yield or disease resistance. An example of that would be something like corn. Corn started out as essentially just a stalk of grass, and now it is that really elaborate corn cob that provides us with a lot of nutrition, and that has happened over selective breeding of many generations. Domestic dogs are still, however, one of the greatest examples of selective breeding because of the huge variation in domesticated dogs compared to wild populations. We can really see how this has played out. So any population, as we know from our study of genetics, shows variation in traits. So how selective breeding works is individuals that do not show the desired trait are not allowed to breed. Individuals that do show the traits that you want to build up in your population are chosen to breed together. When those individuals breed together, the next generation will have an increased frequency of those desired traits because both of the parents had it. From those offspring, you repeat the process. So you take the individuals from that generation with the most desirable traits, you breed them together, and so on and so forth. And eventually, you get all these really unique breeds of dogs. Dogs can look different, they can be different size, they have many, many differences between different types of dogs. And so that process is just selective breeding, taking the traits that you want and breeding animals with those traits until you have these really specific breeds. Another example of evidence for evolution that we can see is homologous structures. So homologous means same. So if we look at comparative anatomy of groups of animals or plants, we can see structures that are similar. So if you look over here, we have click on the limb that's not like the others. So if you were to click on a limb that was not like the others, obviously this one and this one have a very similar bone structure, whereas this one has no bones, so you would eliminate this one. So homologous structures are structures that are similar in shape in different types of organisms as a result of common ancestry. So essentially what that means is all 4 of these organisms here have a same common ancestor. That common ancestor had a general structure in their limb, and even though those species then diverged, they all share that similar structure. So if you look at a human arm, in the upper arm there's 1 bone, in the forearm there's 2 bones, in the wrist there's many arms, and then they separate into fingers. If I look at a dog leg, the upper leg has 1 bone, then there's 2 bones, then there's a wrist, then there's fingers. If I look at a bird wing, I have 1 bone, 2 bones, wrist, fingers. If I look at a whale fin, I have 1 bone, 2 bone, wrist, fingers. So all of these are similar structures that are most likely the result of common ancestry. This also illustrates adaptive radiation, which is when one species radiates into many different species to fulfill different ecological niches. The more exclusive the shared homologies, the closer the two organisms are related. So essentially, the more unique what they share is, then the closer they are related, because things that are more closely related are more likely to share these traits. But the pentadactyl limb here is one of the primary examples of a homologous structure. So we can see it again here. We have the one bone, two bones, wrist, fingers. And we have the same kind of general pattern for both forelimbs and hind limbs, so for both arms and legs in humans. And you can see here all of these examples of similar structures. We see it in bats, we see it in dolphins, we see it in anteaters, moles, horses, pigs, monkeys, all have this same general structure. They take that structure and they adapt it to different uses. So bats are for flying, moles are adapted for digging, monkeys are adapted for grasping. But the same general structure persists throughout all of those organisms. So despite the fact that there are obvious differences between those organisms, the organisms all share the same bones. So even though they are not identical, because they have that very similar pattern, that tells us that the most likely reason for that is a shared ancestor. Populations of species can gradually diverge into separate species by evolution. So that's how evolution functions. Population of one species over time gradually diverges. So for instance, if I have a population of fruit flies that becomes separated because of a storm, then it's very likely that that population, those two different populations will experience two different ecological conditions. Over many generations, the shape of the flies are likely to diverge just as a result of natural selection. So because they're exposed to different ecological conditions, different traits are going to be valuable to different populations, and so they're going to build up differences between the two. If the fruit flies that got blown onto the island migrate back to the mainland, they will probably not easily be able to mate with those mainland flies, because over this time they've developed different mating rituals and they have genetic differences because of that natural selection and because of just natural variation. It's very unlikely that those two populations would have the same genetic changes over that time. So in all likelihood, there's going to be genetic differences. Because genes can no longer flow between those two populations, because the island flies can no longer mate with the mainland flies, these two species, these two populations are now said to be different species. So once they cannot exchange genes between the two populations, they are now two different species. There are lots of examples of this. One of the most famous is, of course, the finches on the Galapagos Island. There was a finch on the mainland of what is Ecuador now. In a storm, it got blown out to the Galapagos Islands, and on each of the islands, a different variety of that finch evolved. So they all started as the same exact species, but because there were different needs on each of these different islands, it ended up going from one species to all these different species. Another one of the core tenets of evolution is that there is continuous variation across the geographical range of related populations. So in simple terms, there is variation within a population. So if I look at these four pictures, which of these birds are the same species and which are different species? Well, the top two are willow ptarmigans, one female, one male, and the bottom two are red grouses, one male, one female. Now that I pointed out, you can see the similarities, right? So at one point, those two were classified as separate species. However, the current scientific consensus is actually that they are both members of the same species. So all four of those pictures are individuals within the same species. So you can see it's a common problem in classification to determine when two populations of one species have sufficiently diverged to become two separate species. Those 4 look pretty different, and yet they are still the same species. Even though they've diverged, they have not diverged enough to be considered two separate species. Populations will gradually continue to diverge over time, and it is natural to see continuous variation across a geographical range. And the greater the geographical separation, and the longer those species have been separated, then the greater the divergence. But it still takes a really long time to separate one species into two. So that continuous variation, the fact that there is variation within a population, even across a geographical range, that's going to cause some difficulty in determining whether or not things have speciated, but it is also one of the driving factors behind speciation. So this animation, if you go to this animation on a browser that can run Flash, it's a really good example of evolution in action in peppered moths in the UK around the time of the Industrial Revolution. They actually saw the changes in the moths. These pepper moths are found in two forms. They are found in this light form, so you may be able to see the outline of the moth there. There's a moth there against the light background, or this darker moth. So we have lighter moths over here, and we have darker moths over here. The darker moth normally is very rare. In a normal environment, unpolluted area, the tree branches are covered in this pale colored lichen. So when the trees are covered in this pale color, this lighter colored moth can just blend right in. So at night they fly around to try to find a mate, but during the day they rest on the branches of trees and they have this great camouflage, so they're hard to find. Birds and other animals are going to search for them, of course, though, because they need food. However, there was an environmental change with the Industrial Revolution, which is that pollution killed the lichens and soot blackened the tree branches. So the tree branches went from being this light color to being this dark color. So that meant that with that environmental change, the dark moths are now better camouflaged from birds against those dark tree branches, whereas this light moth against this dark background will be really easy to see and will be much more susceptible to predation by birds. And so few of them are going to be able to survive to reproduce. So because the darker ones are surviving and reproducing, they will pass on their darker coloration to the next generation, and over time the population will shift from being primarily light colored to being primarily dark colored. Now, environmental policies in Europe have reduced air pollution, and this evolution is actually reversing. So for a time, this population was dominated by the dark coloration, but now with the return of these lichens and the lighter colored branches, the population is shifting back towards the lighter coloration. So we have a cartoon here, two parents and offspring. Offspring says, "Mom, Dad, there's something you need to know. I'm a mammal." So how does this cartoon fit in with this topic? Well, new groups diverge from prior groups. So at some point, there is an individual that is an offspring, and yet the offspring and the parents must be members of two different groups, because all organisms come from pre-existing organisms. But now this offspring has a combination of traits that put it within a group, in this case mammals, that the parents were not a part of. Which is all to say that evolution is complicated when you try to look at particulars, but there is so much evidence that supports this concept. Trying to figure out when evolution has evolved is a much more complicated topic. So that concludes 5.1 notes. Again, I would strongly suggest you check out BioNinja. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I hope that you learned a lot, and I will see you the next time.